Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. Today we were diving into one of the most insane economic bubbles in human history. A story so ridiculous that if I told you it was fiction, you'd say it was too stupid to believe. I'm talking about tulip mania, the period in the 1630s when the Dutch literally went so crazy for flower bulbs that they nearly destroyed their entire economy. And I'm not exaggerating. At the peak of this madness, a single tulip bulb was worth more than a house. More than 10 times the annual salary of a skilled craftsman, and people were mortgaging their homes to buy flowers that hadn't even bloomed yet. A plain red tulip might suddenly produce offspring with intricate patterns of white, purple, and yellow stripes. But in the 1630s, they just thought it was magic. They developed elaborate classification systems for different types of broken tulips, gave them exotic names like Semper Augustus and Viceroy, and started treating them like precious gems. The Dutch called these broken tulips, and they became obsessed with them because each one was unique and unpredictable. The wealthy merchants and nobles who could afford these rare tulips started using them as status symbols. The futures market meant that you didn't need to actually know anything about tulips to speculate on them. The Netherlands was still a relatively new republic, having recently broken free from Spanish rule. Taverns throughout Holland became informal tulip exchanges where people would gather to trade bulbs and contracts, and create detailed contracts specifying exactly what colors and patterns were expected. Some of the most valuable tulips had names like Admiral of Admirals and General of Generals, as if they were military heroes rather than flowers. Stories spread throughout Holland about people who had made fortunes overnight by buying and selling tulips. But as the bubble grew and more ordinary citizens got involved, officials started to worry. They could see that people were mortgaging their homes, selling their businesses, and borrowing money to speculate on flower bulbs. The entire economy was becoming dependent on the continued rise in tulip prices. Everyone knew someone who had bought a bulb for a few guilders and sold it for hundreds. People were paying prices for bulbs that bore no relationship to their actual value as flowers or even as luxury goods. And how an entire economy came crashing down because people finally realized that a flower bulb is just a flower bulb, no matter how pretty the flower might be. Trust me, the crash was even more spectacular than the rise. The most expensive tulips were selling for more than the cost of a large house in Amsterdam, and the buyers were ordinary people who had convinced themselves that tulips were better than money. The success stories were real, but people didn't talk about the failures. The people who lost everything when their tulips didn't bloom as expected or when they couldn't find buyers for their contracts. These weren't sophisticated financial institutions. They were drinking establishments where craftsmen, merchants, and laborers would get drunk and make deals worth more than their annual income. The atmosphere was more like a casino than a flower market. The traditional aristocracy was weak, and there was a lot of social mobility for successful merchants and craftsmen. Tulip speculation became a way for middle-class people to try to join the ranks of the wealthy elite. Tulips became symbols of Dutch ingenuity, prosperity, and sophistication. Owning rare tulips was a way of participating in the Dutch Golden Age, of being part of the economic miracle that was transforming a small, swampy country into a global superpower. If you could make a killing in tulips, you could buy your way into high society. You didn't need to be a gardener, you didn't need to understand horticulture, you didn't even need to have seen a tulip bloom. All you needed was the belief that someone else would pay more for your contract than you paid for it. Dutch merchants were making fortunes from trade with Asia, the Americas, and the rest of Europe. There was more liquid capital floating around the Netherlands than anywhere else in the world. Wealthy people were looking for new ways to invest their money and show off their success. Having a garden full of exotic tulips became a way to show that you were sophisticated, well-traveled, and incredibly wealthy. Dutch merchants, being the innovative capitalists they were, started selling contracts for tulip bulbs that were still in the ground. You could buy a bulb in winter that wouldn't be harvested until summer, and you could sell that contract to someone else before the bulb was even dug up. Suddenly, people were trading pieces of paper representing flowers they had never seen. Based on descriptions of colors and patterns that might or might not actually exist, and because tulips only bloomed for a few weeks each year, you had to own the bulbs year-round to prove you could afford them. It was like gambling and gardening combined into one addictive package. Picture this. It's 1637 in Amsterdam, and you rewatching grown men in a tavern screaming bids at each other over a fucking flower bulb. Not a house, not a ship, not gold or silver, a bulb, piece of plant matter that might or might not produce a pretty flower next spring. Tulips arrived in the Netherlands around 1593, brought by a botanist named Carolus Clusius, who was working at the University of Leiden. At first, they were just curiosities. Pretty flowers that wealthy people grew in their gardens to show off their sophisticated taste and international connections. These guys are literally betting their life savings on whether a tulip will have the right color stripes when it blooms. And the craziest part, this wasn't just a few rich idiots with too much money. This was an entire society that had collectively lost its goddamn mind. But here's the thing that makes this story even more bizarre. Tulips are uneven native to the Netherlands. They came from Turkey, brought to Europe in the 16th century by diplomats and traders who thought they were exotic curiosities. The Dutch didn't invent tulips. They didn't discover them. They just happened to be really good at growing them, and even better at convincing people they were worth more than gold. Let me tell you how this whole clusterfuck started, because it's a perfect example of how human psychology can turn literally anything into a speculative bubble. But here's where it gets interesting. Tulips have this weird genetic quirk where they can produce dramatically different colored flowers from the same bulb. What the Dutch didn't know at the time was that these beautiful color variations were actually caused by a virus, the tulip-breaking virus that weakened the plants and made them produce less viable offspring. Now, here's where human psychology starts to take over. The Dutch Golden Age was in full swing during this period, and Amsterdam was becoming the richest city in Europe. But here's what really kicked off the tulip bubble: the development of the futures market. This is where the whole thing starts to get completely insane. The social dynamics of Dutch society made this bubble even more explosive. Let me paint you a picture of how crazy this got. The Dutch developed elaborate rituals around tulip trading. They would examine bulbs with magnifying glasses, debate the subtle differences between varieties. But here's what's really fascinating about the psychology of tulip mania. It was unjust about greed. It was about the Dutch national identity. The bubble was also fueled by what we now call FOMO, of missing out. The Dutch government initially tried to ignore the tulip trade, treating it as a harmless hobby for wealthy people. By 1636, the tulip market had become completely detached from reality. In Part 2, we'll explore how this insane bubble reached its peak, the moment when reality finally crashed into the fantasy.